Welcome to the second video in this video series exploring the basic coordination and vocabulary within the context of jazz drumming. In the first video, I explored the use of the snare drum and how we can learn to get comfortable playing it against an unchanging ride cymbal and hi-hat ostinato. We could repeat this same process with the bass drum, and indeed we should, but I'm not going to demonstrate that process here today. It is a simple repetition of that same concept. Instead, I'm going to explore the core of modern jazz drumming, which is linear phrasing, linear comping between the bass drum and the snare drum. Now, the main concept of this today is going to be exploring the way that the bass drum and the snare drum can interact with each other. And this actually develops into quite an advanced concept, but it is one that is somewhat required to play jazz in a musical and competent way. Now, I'm exploring the vocabulary on set 1.1 bass drum and snare drum from the Drum Kit Coordination Patterns Jazz and Blues book. And this is providing us with some core vocabulary to practice and crucially some basic ideas that we're going to expand outwards into our comping repertoire. So, I stated that the main concept here was to explore the relationship between the bass drum and the snare drum, how they talk to each other, how they interact. We need to become comfortable with that. So first, I'm simply going to run through the first set of exercises from A to N, which are all based on an eighth note subdivision, crucially a swung eighth note subdivision. 1, 2, 3, 4, The vocabulary here is largely rudimental. This is based off single strokes, double strokes, and paradiddles played between the bass drum and the snare drum. So I'll just play each of them a few times so you can get a sense for the sort of vocabulary we are working with today. So they are all of the ways that we can play a linear phrase between the bass drum and the snare drum over 2 beats of the bar using swung eighth notes. At this stage, this is to expose us to the coordination required to actually play that. We are simply dealing with the execution, the physical act of playing these phrases, because in order for us to comp successfully, competently, musically, we have to have those bass drum and snare drums acting somewhat independently from what the ride cymbal and the hi-hat are doing. So at this stage, we can think of this first pass as like an exercise. It really is just an exercise to get us used to playing in this way. However, what we really want to be doing, and this is going to be the main focus of today, is exploring the vocabulary. So I'm going to take one of these exercises itself, which is exercise D. Now, exercise D is based off a double stroke roll phrase played between the bass drum and the snare drum. We can hear there it's a double stroke roll, but it begins on the second note of the double. Boom, bat, bat, boom, boom, bat, bat, boom. So it's displaced by 1 step. Now we can work through exercises C, D, E, and F together as a combination to work through all of the possible permutations of the double stroke roll. Beginning with 2 on the bass drum, it would sound like this. Working in this way, again, exposes us to one of the core ways in which the bass drum and the snare drum interact with each other. They can alternate either with single strokes or with double strokes. Yes, we can alternate with triple strokes as well, but that is a little bit less common. But the double stroke phrasing and the transition which is played on a single stroke is really, really fundamental. These are the fundamental ways that the bass drum and the snare drum talk to each other, so we need to be comfortable with them. But far more important than that is the vocabulary this is giving us exposure to. This is giving us ideas. This is feeding us new vocabulary. So what I'm going to do now is take the next step and actually start improvising just with these 4 double stroke roll ideas. But rather than thinking of them as 4 ideas, I'm thinking of them as one idea, the double stroke roll, but the different permutations. I can begin on the first stroke on the bass drum, the second stroke on the bass drum, the first stroke on the snare, or the second stroke on the snare, and I'm going to incorporate rests, pauses, repetition. And what I'm doing here, as well as increasing my ability to actually play the thing, to execute it, I'm teaching myself vocabulary. I'm listening to what sounds good, to what works. I'm exploring, doing trial and error, and I will stumble upon certain things that sound really good, and then I will hold on to it and try and repeat it. But the whole time, I'm improvising. I'm trying to use this vocabulary not to practice with, but to speak. I'm actually trying to perform at the same time, using this vocabulary, using these patterns and ideas as the base. Let's have a go. Now, it's actually rather difficult to describe how exactly what I played lines up with the basic patterns that we began with, but hopefully you could hear that almost everything I played was informed by that double stroke idea. Now I'm going to repeat the same process, but I'm going to start exploring some simple orchestration around the drums. My left hand is the only one that's going to move here because my bass drum is, of course, a fixed position. Something like this. So there are 2 main processes going on. I'm trying to focus primarily on the double stroke phrasing, but I'm also trying to focus on the motifs I'm playing in a musical sense. I'm trying to use repetition, call and response, thematic development. Straight away, even at this early stage of practicing, I'm trying to incorporate these higher musical concepts, because otherwise we are just going to learn a pattern by rote, and when we play it in a real situation, it's just going to sound like we are playing a pattern. We don't want that. We want to arm ourselves, equip ourselves with musical vocabulary that we can actually use appropriately, responding to the musical stimuli from the rest of the band. Now, our next step is to take this into a slightly more advanced rhythmic context. And to do this, we can look at the second half of the set here, which deals with triplet vocabulary. So first of all, just so you can hear what this sounds like, I'm going to run through exercises O to the end of the set, which is Y, and you will hear the similar phrases, single strokes, double strokes, and paradiddles, but on a triplet subdivision this time. got single stroke, double stroke, and paradiddle permutations happening there. Now, again, we could apply the same concept. We could choose a particular combination. We could apply the different orchestration. We can improvise with it, and we indeed should do all of those things. But what I want to do now is bring this back to what we were working on previously. Now, essentially, giving that a first pass, going with all of that triplet vocabulary, is exposing me to what it feels like to play that triplet vocabulary. I'm learning it. I'm becoming familiar with it. I'm understanding what it sounds like and what it feels like to play. Now, crucially in there were the same double stroke permutations, the same double stroke combinations as the eighth note part of the phrase, the eighth note part of the set that we began with, and at the very end, the longer paradiddle phrase. This is all giving me, as I said, familiarity with what it feels like to play these and what they sound like as ideas. But crucially, we're going to apply this back to that initial phrase that we began with, which was that double stroke roll. Now, having practiced the latter part of this set with its triplet variations, I'm armed with the knowledge and the experience and, after enough time, the ability to play the triplet version of that phrase. And the same displaced permutations as we did with the eighth note. So now, if I return to that simple improvisation exercise where I'm basing my comping loosely on that double stroke roll, but thinking primarily in terms of the motivic development, I'm now armed with this new triplet vocabulary to further add character to my ideas. And I could go on and on, adopting this approach, this attitude of exploration, trial and error. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? And again, it's very difficult to explain exactly how everything I just played links back to that double stroke roll, except I'm really consciously using that double stroke roll between the bass drum and the snare drum as the foundation for everything I'm playing there. But maybe primarily, although I'm trying to keep it 50-50, I'm focusing on the motifs I'm playing, the musical ideas, trying to think of it as an improvised solo that actually sounds good, is musical. Because when I come to play this for real, when I next play with a jazz band, I don't want to be limited to playing a pattern. Now, don't get me wrong, some of those things on their own do sound quite good, but it becomes very clear very quickly that that's what I'm limited to, if that's all I've practiced. If I'm only to play double strokes, if I'm only able to play double strokes as an exercise, then they are forever going to sound like exercises. And it wouldn't be long before the rest of the band, and perhaps more importantly, the audience, realized that I wasn't actually having a conversation. I wasn't adding something to the conversation. I was simply regurgitating a set pattern. So by practicing from the point of view of musicality, from the point of view of vocabulary, not only are we increasing our technical ability, our coordination ability, but we are actually feeding ourselves musical vocabulary, genuine musical ideas, which doesn't mean when we get on the bandstand we're just repeating those exact same musical ideas. It means we have the experience and the confidence to draw upon to create new ideas that are appropriate for the context. But, crucially, underpinning it all, we have practiced the coordination, the technical requirement, and the mindset, the mental attitude required to produce musical ideas. So I hope this has given you something to think about. I hope this has given you some ideas as how to not only practice, but apply the linear vocabulary in this jazz context. If you enjoy what I do, please consider visiting my website where you'll find my array of publications. I offer lessons both in the studio and online, or just stop by with any questions or just to say hello. It would be great to hear from you. Otherwise, good luck with your own practice. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.